Hi, fifth graders. It's Mrs. Belatesh. I'm glad to be with you today. Today, we're going to talk about dissolving different types of solids in a liquid. So the liquid is the solvent, and the thing that's going to dissolve is the solute. So we're going to try dissolving some different types of salt, kosher salt and Epsom salt, in a solvent, water. If the same amount of salt and the same amount of Epsom salt will dissolve in the water. So that's the question I want answered. And one of the things that we're going to try to do is that we're going to reach saturation in the water. Saturation means that the water will not absorb any more salt. Let's start with getting your science notebook. The title for today is Saturated Solutions. And first, I want to tell you what saturation is. And saturation is kind of like a sponge that cannot absorb any more water. The sponge is saturated. So I have a bowl of water here, and I have my sponge, and I'm going to squeeze out all the water. But now I'm going to put my sponge in the water, and I'm going to soak up as much water as I can. So my sponge is now soaking up, absorbing the water, and some water is dripping out because gravity's pulling it. But do you notice there's still water in the bowl? My sponge will not soak up any more water. My sponge is saturated. Well, that can also happen with solutions. The water will get to the point where it cannot absorb any more salt. When a solvent, like water, cannot absorb any more solute, like salt, we say it is saturated. Today, we're going to look at how much salt water can absorb until it is saturated. Half of you will be putting kosher salt in water and finding out how much salt the water will absorb before it is saturated. Half of you will be putting in Epsom salt into the water to find out how much Epsom salt the water will absorb before it is saturated. 1/4 of you guys are going to put 50 milliliters of water into a bottle. Another 1/4 of you guys is going to put another 50 milliliters of water into a bottle. So you have 2 bottles each with 50 milliliters of water. One of you is going to put kosher salt in this water. The other is going to put Epsom salt into this water. This is how you're going to add the salt. You're going to use this funnel. Make sure that you don't put any water in it right now. You're going to put the bottle underneath the funnel, and then you're going to add spoons of salt. Keep track of how many spoons of salt you add. I'm going to add 2 spoons of salt, and then I'm going to put the top on the bottle and shake it. I'm going to shake it until the salt dissolves. All my salt dissolved, so I'm going to add some more salt. If your team is doing Epsom salt, put the bottle underneath the funnel and add 2 spoons of Epsom salt. Put the top on and shake. I'm going to add 1 more spoon of Epsom salt. Put the top on and shake. Okay, I added several spoons of salt to the water. This is kosher salt. And you see, even though I have shaken it and shaken it and shaken it, the bottom of the bottle is covered with salt. That will not dissolve. This water is saturated. It cannot absorb any more salt. This bottle has got the Epsom salt in it. I added several spoons of Epsom salt, and you can see that there's a little bit of salt at the bottom. At this point, I believe that this solution is saturated. It will not absorb any more Epsom salt. I want you to take a look at this. We put in 50 milliliters of water into both bottles, but now we can see that one of them has a greater volume. That might give you a little bit of a clue. Please make sure in your science notebook, if you did the kosher salt and water, that you record the number of spoons of salt until the water is saturated. And the same thing with the Epsom salt. The number of spoons that you put in until the water is saturated. Okay, I have a question. Does it take 6 or 7 spoons of salt to saturate the water? Let's say I put 7 spoons of salt. Do I say it takes 7 spoons of salt to saturate the water? Not really, because some salt's on the bottom. That was not dissolved, so it is not part of the saturated solution. The same thing with the Epsom salt. There is still some amount of solid that is not dissolved in the water. I don't want to know how much was not dissolved. I want to know how much was dissolved. Could we use a balance scale to find out the mass of the salt that was dissolved? I could pour this water into here and then put it on the balance scale, but I might get some grains inside. I want to get all the saturated water, but no solid salt. So maybe I should use a filter. But if I use a dry filter, the filter will absorb some of the water. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to use a filter, but we're going to get it wet first. You're going to get a coffee filter like this, and you're going to put it in the water. I'm going to get it completely saturated with water. Oh, saturated again. And I'm going to let all the water drip out. Now I know the coffee filter will not absorb any of the salt water. Now, this is how to put the filter in. It might be good to fold it over like this and fold it over again like this. So it's a quarter. Put it into the filter, and then you're going to use one side to be open. So it's kind of like a cone. Okay? It's a cone. Don't pour it through if you don't see paper on both sides. It's a cone. And now I'm going to get an empty cup, and I'm going to pour my water through the wet filter. Let it drip a few times so all of the water goes through the filter. I filtered out the Epsom salt water, and now I'm going to do the same procedure. I have a new filter. It's wet. It's folded into a cone. I can see the paper on both sides of the filter, and now I'm going to filter out the salt water. Make sure it stops dripping before you remove the filter. Okay, now I have my 2 saturated solutions, and now I'm going to use the balance scale to find out the mass of the dissolved salt and the dissolved Epsom salt. This is my saturated Epsom salt water. I put it on the balance scale, and I already know that I have 50 milliliters of water. So that is at least 50 grams. I'm going to start with 50 grams. Here's 50 grams. 90 grams, 100 grams, 100 grams, 102 grams. So I'm going to say mine was 102 grams. I'm going to record that information. Now I'm going to measure the mass of the kosher salt water, the kosher salt solution, which is saturated. I'm going to start with 50 grams. 62 grams. Let's record that information. So now I have recorded that information in my notebook. I said the mass of the Epsom salt solution and the mass of the salt water solution. So this was a very interesting experiment. Remember how I'm always talking about the properties of things? I have curly hair, I have brown eyes. Those are the properties, some properties of me. A property of salt and Epsom salt is that they dissolve differently in water. We had 2 bottles of water, 50 milliliters each. And yet, we had much more Epsom salt dissolve in the water before it was saturated, much more than the kosher salt. So a property of Epsom salt is that it dissolves easier and more can dissolve in water before it is saturated, before the water is saturated. A property of salt is that it does dissolve in water. Less salt dissolves in water before it reaches the water's saturation point. So let's wrap up this experiment, and I want us to write in your science notebook how much Epsom salt can dissolve in water before it is saturated. Well, if you take 50 milliliters of water, we know it weighs 50 grams. We know that's the mass of 50 milliliters of water. And when I measured the mass of my saturated Epsom salt water, it was 102 grams. So my water absorbed 52 grams of Epsom salt. Now, the temperature might be different of yours. You might not shake it as vigorously as me. So I would accept anything between 25 and 55 grams of Epsom salt on your experiment. Now, if you did the salt, how much kosher salt can dissolve in water before it is saturated? So we know 50 milliliters of water is 50 grams. My saturated water weighed 62 grams. So the mass of the salt was 12 grams. And I will accept anything between 10 and 15 grams. So we know that Epsom salt is more soluble. More of it dissolves in water than kosher salt. We're going to be dissolving something new next week, not a salt. We're going to actually dissolve an acid. See you next week, Cougars.